Welcome to episode 72 of the Hoopsfix Podcast with me, your host, Sam Nita, full-time British basketball advocate. And on this week's show, we have Dave Forrester, long-term assistant of the Newcastle Eagles, who stepped down last week after over 10 years on the sidelines with Fab Flournoy, who obviously ended up leaving the Eagles to make the jump to the NBA the season before last, just before the season that's just gone. And Dave has obviously made the decision to step down. He said that his decision was always to step down when Fab went, but he'd recruited the team that played last season, so he wanted to stick that out alongside Ian McLeod. And week before last, he announced that he would be stepping away from the sidelines. Dave has a unique perspective on the game. His story is kind of crazy, actually, going from a fan to ending up as an assistant coach with the club. But not only that, he has been involved with the game at almost every level. He's a board member of the Eagles Community Foundation. He is a trained referee. He runs a CVL. He obviously helps with Eagles recruiting, has been an assistant coach, so has a very unique insight into not just on the court, but off the court, the behind the scenes things, the general state of the game of British basketball, which is obviously something that I am incredibly passionate about and something I love talking about. And so me and him have had many, many conversations over the years, and this was an opportunity to get into that in more detail. Before we do get into this week's show, please take 2 seconds to check out our Patreon account, patreon.com/HOOPSFIX. There you can start to give us a monthly contribution of as much or as little as you would like to help us do the work that we're doing to help try and grow this British basketball media landscape. So please go and check it out, patreon.com/Hoopsfix. Have a listen to the show. As always, let me know what you think. You can drop me an email if you prefer it personal, sam@hoopsfix.com, or you can hit me up on every single social media platform at Hoopsfix. And if you're watching on YouTube, by all means, leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Let's get some discussion going. Anyway, here is this week's show with me and Dave Forrester. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam.
So, obviously, big news last week. Was it last week? Week before last? In the last fortnight, anyway. You obviously stepping away from the sidelines with the Eagles. So I think that's the obvious place to start. You know, you've done a decade-ish, predominantly with Fab. Kind of talk about that decision and why you've made that decision to stop being the assistant coach of the Eagles.
Not quite sure how big news it was, but it's news up here, I think, to a certain degree. In reality, everything has its span and its lifespan. And when I started, we didn't know how long it was going to be for. It was kind of a very much see how you get on and see how it works and see if it can be balanced around family life, etc. And then it kind of took on a life of its own, in the way that we were able to fit our lives around it. Ended up with him living upstairs in the house, so the whole thing kind of moved on to the point whereby we were almost indivisible for a period of time. I'd always, I think, took the view that when he stopped, I would stop, because I'm always been slightly uneasy with the concept of, as it were, a volunteer assistant coach in the BBL. I don't really think, ultimately my profession isn't as a basketball coach. And I was always very conscious of the fact that I didn't want to get in the way of other people. It's a big thing in this country about developing people within the sport and creating an economy from the sport. And I didn't want to do that. But the reality of the situation was with Fab that because he was a player coach, it was slightly different to being a normal assistant. There was only certain things he could do, and there were certain things he needed to be done, and kind of we didn't overlap. We kind of dovetailed. So what he didn't really do, I did, and it got to the point whereby we kind of understood I knew what he was thinking when he was on the court, and that was a very valuable thing. And to the point whereby it wouldn't have been fair on him, I think, for me at that point to have walked away for somebody else. Now, we brought Ian in halfway through, I think probably 2014. And that was a deliberate effort, to say, look, we have to have a pathway here as well. It can't just be about, a 41-year-old player coach playing all the minutes with a lawyer on the sideline telling them what to do. It really, that's not the way we want to run a professional franchise. And so that kind of worked that way. But when Ian came to the fore, obviously when Fab left, a week before the season, when Toronto offered him, and we'd already recruited that team. I didn't feel I could walk away at that point. I thought that would have been extraordinarily unfair. Mac was happy for me to be there to kind of guide him along, as it were. Well, he didn't really need that much guidance, to be fair, because he took to it like I took to water. But the stuff that I was doing for Fab, Ian doesn't need me to do, because Ian's perfectly capable of doing it, and he's a head coach, not a player head coach. So it seemed to me it was a natural time for him to build his team and his organisation, and every head coach has to have control over everything that they want, and we have to have more opportunities for young coaches in this country. And on top of that, we'd won. So we've won 14 trophies in 10 years. We'd been at the top 3 for the entire period of time that I'd been there. There's only so many times you can climb a mountain. There's only so many times you can drive to Plymouth. And get back at 3 o'clock in the morning and be at court, be at work at 9 o'clock the next morning, and so it was just time. So that's a long answer to a short question, but it was just time.
Yeah, that's perfect. You kind of alluded to there. So your day job is a criminal defence lawyer. Is that the official title? Yeah,
magistrate criminal defence lawyer. Yeah.
And your story is obviously quite remarkable, because you kind of started out as a fan of the Eagles, and then somehow, decades later, years later, you're on the sidelines, on the bench. Can you kind of discuss that journey? Like, I'd love to hear sort of your background. I guess starting with like how you actually first started getting involved with basketball, and then sort of the journey through to getting on the bench with the Eagles.
Yeah, I'll try and give you the abridged version, because otherwise it could take a while. I was fortunate because I grew up in what was in effect in the 1980s in a basketball town. Gateshead was a basketball town. And I say that because the senior school I went to had won the national championships a few years beforehand. Had a guy called Keith Ramsey who ended up playing for Manchester Giants, playing for them. We had a teacher who was kind of a mini Jimmy Rogers of Gateshead, who just passed away last year, and everybody in the whole of the Northeast basketball scene was at his funeral, a man called John Brabham. We had a lovely kind of wooden floored gym in the school, and we also had a National League team based at the Leisure Centre, which was basically a 5-minute bus ride from where I lived. It was just 3 stops on the bus. And because we had a National League team and at one point a Carlsberg League team for a couple of seasons, the council employed some of the local players, some of the players, to coach as well as to play. It's the same model in many ways as some areas now. So from the age of about 9, my first coach on a Thursday night at the Leisure Centre was Curtis Xavier, who I think you may well even have interviewed. And then Curtis did about 3. Yeah, that was interesting. He had an interesting way of coaching 9-year-olds. we did a lot of running and sitting on the wall and that type of stuff. And then 3 years later, the Gates had signed a young kid from Birmingham called Paul Douglas.
Dougie.
Yeah, Dougie. Everybody knows Dougie. So Dougie came up, and he became the basketball development officer. So for the age from about 12 to 15 or 16, every session was with Dougie, and so we're getting some proper coaching. And he kind of took us around on the metro, on the local metro system to find games and that type of stuff. And we had some decent players come out of that, but there was nothing organised like it is now. The National League wasn't organised like it was now. So there were players like John Paul Herron and Mark Miller, who ended up on the Eagles bench, Adam Barnes and people like that, who came through the system, came through, in effect, Dougie's work. And then Gary Smith Chicken came up as well, and he was here for a couple of years, and so involved with him. So that kind of got me into the sport, and I used to watch the games religiously. I was always very keen on numbers as a kid, very analytical. So the sport, the competition, and the numbers, and the fact it was kind of a foreign sport and there was something to understand, that really attracted us. And so I got into this, played a bit. Wasn't a great player, but was kind of quite a heady point guard. Never going to be good enough to make anything of myself in the sport. Not big enough, not athletic enough. Couldn't use my left hand, all that stuff. So at 18, went to college, went to university at Durham. Again, stayed in the Northeast. Played for the university team there, but very different to what it is now. You don't get the sports side, very different. It was like a local league, to the point whereby the coach of the team each year was the kid who was most interested the last year. So I was most interested in my second year, so they made me the player coach in the third year. That was the level of selection. Then you turn up at freshers trials and you desperately hope there's a couple of Americans come over as grad students who can score 50 a game for you. So that kind of got into that. As I was playing football for the university, goalkeeper for the university first team, and basketball as well. So it was quite busy, didn't do much law. And then after 3 years at Durham, went to Northumbria, which is a legal practice course which you have to do to become a lawyer. And at Northumbria, one of the people on the basketball team and one of the people studying there was Paul Blake. So Paul, and that team was coached by Billy Spragg, who was the assistant coach at the Eagles. So this is probably 95, 96, just before Paul got involved with running the sporting club in John Hall. So I met Paul and got on all right with him there, and we just student basketball lifestyle, etc. Get know each other, and then finished university, went off to work. Actually spent some time in the summers coaching football in America. Because that's kind of my other sport, my other passion, and came back, went to work, and kind of played a little bit of local league. But a couple of years later, we formed a local league team out of Eagles fans. At that point, we're very keen. The firm sponsored the Eagles, so we had courtside seats. I worked for my dad's office, my dad's firm, so my dad's firm sponsored the Eagles. So it was a family firm. Having set up a local league team called the Zorbers, which was just basically a bunch of Eagles fans who most of whom had either never played or hadn't played for donkey's years. Became the player coach, tried to work out how to run a 12-man rotation in local league to make sure everybody was happy. Travelled around, was still very, very interested in the BBL because basketball was my sport. I was, basically mid-20s, single, so that was one of the way I spent my time. Used to travel around to games with Paul Nielsen, who you'll know from various different areas, women's basketball now, but Paul was also played for the Zorbers. Travelled around with the Eagles for that. We did some little kind of social media videos at the time. We did Eagles web radio. Web radio came on, so we actually broadcast some of the games on kind of dial-up connections from Bletchley Leisure Centre or John Sanford Centre, and desperately, with some kit which looks like it came out of the ark, got involved that way. And then probably, also commented quite regularly on What's Bev. Sometimes Fab liked it, sometimes he didn't. And then,
are you confirming that Fab reads What's Bev?
He did for a while, until he worked out. He did at a younger age. Yes. I remember they won a game at Leicester by about 20, and I'd been down there as a fan, and I thought he didn't. I thought he made a few mistakes in the coaching, and I put something on the website, and I knew Billy Spragg quite well, and Billy came to us, I think, and said, Fab saw this, he wasn't very happy. He's like, his decision. So that kind of happened, and Paul, probably after the 2006 season, after the clean sweep season with TJ and Jeremy, I was talking to Paul a little bit more, and he asked me to kind of help out a little bit with the scouting, because that was kind of my niche, numbers, knowledge, not saying knowledge, but information as to players stored. That's kind of what I've got stored in my head, good recollection of dates and times and that type of stuff, and ability to compare players across the pond. It wasn't all done on video then, so it was a bit harder. And I remember the first time he introduced me to Fab, and I remember Fab looking at me extraordinarily suspiciously, thinking, he's just another English guy who shouts from the sidelines, doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He might be right. And Paul showed me a video, or Paul had some videos in of players, and he asked me about one guy. What do you think of this guy? Dave, in fact, was there. And to be honest, he wasn't up to much. He was making a lot of threes on his highlight video, but he was like 6'6" and being guarded by someone who was 7'1", which basically means that he's not being guarded. So he clearly wasn't a guy who regularly shot the ball. I said to Paul, no. At which point Fab looked at me like, yeah, right, he gets me, he understands. I don't want him. So at that point, we kind of got on a bit better. We kind of started talking a little bit about the game, and I used to talk to him about games after they'd happened. I think they got beat by Milton Keynes in the 2008 Cup final, and he still hurts about that game because they shouldn't have lost that game. It was there at the time because I wasn't on the bench. And I was there in Birmingham with my wife, and it was my second wedding anniversary, because my wedding anniversary is January the 14th, which is always the time of the BBL Cup final. It was always the weekend of the BBL Cup final. And they lost, and I think he rang us up in the hotel at midnight, having lost that game, just to vent. And then I vented back at him, and I think it was about 2:00 in the morning, and the wife is wondering what the heck is going on.
I was going to say, I bet your wife was well happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. She survived it happily. I survived it happily. So that happened, and then just moving on. Eventually, I think in the middle of, I started recruiting some players for him. We got, people. I used to go through the emails basically, because he wasn't particularly a big email person, and I quite enjoyed it, trying to find, the challenge of trying to find a player. And so we got an email, I remember, in 2008 from an agent with about 30 players on, and they mentioned this guy Tafari Tony at the bottom, without any mention, and in brackets put mother born in England. So I kind of went on to, mother born in England, okay. So I started learning about passport laws and stuff like that, and 3 months later, the day before the season, Tap had a passport and he was playing for Newcastle. And that from that moment on, I kind of the thrill of that success of finding a player and getting someone who's going to help the team win and becoming involved, it kind of goes beyond what is being a fan, And then a year and a half later, Billy had to step down, and when Billy stepped down, I said I said to Fab that there was no realistic way I could keep telling him what he'd done wrong after the game if I wasn't willing to sit next to him during the game and try and help him. And he accepted that, and we just kind of moved on from there.
So that was the 2009-2010 season. You actually moved to the bench, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, mid-season game at Guildford just before Christmas.
Right.
So then 3 weeks later, he got himself thrown out for throwing a clipboard across the court at Worthing. And 4 weeks later, I was the head coach of a passive BPL basketball team at London Capital, which was an interesting place to play. You've probably been with him sitting in the crowd, and there was no crowd at London Capital, so he was the crowd, literally about 10 feet away from the court, as I'm trying to tell Leonard Stewart and Joe Chapman and Bridgie and all these guys who are just ultra experienced winners. And I'm trying to figure out, what am I meant to say? How is this meant to work? It was nonsense. It was, it wasn't the way things should be in a perfect functioning system. But it also ended up being something I ended up being quite good at. And when you're working with a player coach, the need for anything, the biggest requirement and the biggest fundamental significant factor for me was to be totally on his wavelength. I couldn't at any point undermine him. I couldn't at any point, we couldn't show any differences in our opinions to the players. There couldn't be any cracks there. We had to be as one. I think I kind of understood that a little bit, probably because of my legal background and what happens when we get instructions from a client, and that's privileged, and you have to work on the basis of sometimes not what you think, but what you're being told your client thinks. And you have to kind of subsume yourself to that. And we kind of ended up in a situation whereby he would allow me to do the things that would take up too much of his energy for when he was playing and coaching. So he would get the team ready, he would have everybody ready, he'd have the game plan ready and all of that stuff. But if there was too much going on in the game in relation to other players, it's such an impossible job to do being a player coach in reality, that there was a danger that it would just overload him. So my job was to make sure he wasn't being overloaded and take off as much as I could with his consent, obviously, to assist him on the way.
Did you ever find it intimidating, being in those situations, and on like when you're, like you said, speaking to these players with a wealth of experience, and did you ever feel insecure maybe about your own background, and that you haven't been coaching for 15, 20 years and now you're on the sidelines? Like, did that cause any issues with regards to sort of gaining the respect of the players maybe?
I think I'm pretty sure, I've never asked them, but I'm quite sure at the beginning their eyebrows were slightly raised. when I came in. But even before I came part of the group, I was attending a few practices because they would practice at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he invited me across to watch the practices, and I started giving scouting reports for them. So what players primarily want is information, and and the information I was giving them was helping. I think they appreciated was helping them win. So I was able to say, look, Tony Dorsey wants to dribble to his right and spin back to his left and shoot a fadeaway. And we need to defend that. We need to stand on his right hand and make him shoot that shot. You can't be giving James Jones or Andy Thompson can't be getting open threes. That's the most important function of this. And there wasn't as much of that going on in the game at that time. It's massively different now because of the technology involved. But we didn't have as much video at that time. The one thing I kind of had the benefit of was a relatively photographic memory in relation to players that I'd seen and assessed and done that. And so I was able to offer that. I think that probably bought me a little bit of credibility with them. And then secondly, the Eagles was very much Fab's way or no one's. So as Fab put it, you're either on the bus or you're off the bus. And so I think the fact that he was happy that I was on the bus, again, gives us that credibility. Yeah. And the final thing, I think, Sam, I don't think I was ever intimidated, no, because when you do the job I do, and I have to go down to prisons, go down to police cells, and see people who can be aggressive, who can be obnoxious, who can be angry, who can be damaged. All I have to do is to deal with them rationally and reasonably and logically. So I carry that through in relation to what's going on. I mean, that trip down to the London Capitals, where I knew I was going to be the head coach, I did spend about 4 hours trying to work out what the hell I was going to say in the locker room beforehand. It's the team we're playing against a team that hasn't won all season. And we've got a team full of vets, who know exactly what they're going to have to do. And the 20 minutes before the game, to leave. And the routine is the coach has to say something. Well, what the hell am I going to say? I think it was some hackneyed old variant version of win one for Fab or some shit like that. Oh, sorry about me. Or something like that, Yeah. And then just shut. Because what he taught me and what you learn very quickly being around pro players, and I didn't know at the time, is that if you've got nothing to say, you say nothing. It's very much like, if you've got nothing to add, they will see it's their jobs, it's their livelihoods. They put themselves on the line, on the line night after night against somebody else who might want to take their job. If they think they're getting some rubbish talked at them, they're not going to listen to you ever again. Yeah. So if you don't know what to say, you just don't say anything. And in certain times, the environment and the culture that he cultivated within the team was very much one of personal responsibility in any event. You do your job, you follow our rules, and we will be good. And basically, if you do your job, you follow our rules, and if we lose, it's our fault. It's not the player's fault. And that helped as well because he was incredibly strong on accountability of players.
When you talk when you talk about your relationship with Fab, am I right in thinking you actually swore him in as a British citizen, right? That was sort of like the early days, and then of course you went on to do all this stuff with him. Can you kind of talk to that the beginning and then the evolution of your relationship over the years?
Yeah, well, I mean, the British citizen thing was just because I was a lawyer and Paul knew I wouldn't charge him. So he grabbed me. It was the season that the first season Fab was at Newcastle with Tony G. Fab was injured all season, got misdiagnosed with his knee. And so I didn't really know him. I hadn't seen anything of him. I remembered him as a guy from Sheffield who couldn't really shoot but played defence, to be honest. That was it. And I was waiting to see what he would bring to the Eagles, but he never played. And then probably in about the April or March of that year, Paul grabbed us from courtside at a game and said, "Can you just sign this oath for him? Or can you bring a Bible along?" We went behind the curtain at the back of the arena where the arena was curtained off. Said, "Hello, I'm Fab." He said, "I'm Dave, pleased to meet you." Right, hold the Bible and say these words after me. So he did that, swore it in. There you go, he's a British citizen. Then Tony left to go to Birmingham, and I remember that summer there was a issue in the papers as to whether or not in the local papers appeared as to whether we would get a player coach, who would be the new coach, and there was choice between Fab and Scants. was what was being pushed in the papers. And I remember thinking, oh, can't be having a player coach. They never work. I hope he gets scans. And I don't think I've ever told Fab this. Paul had obviously seen Fab around and he knew what he was. So then I was basically a radio broadcaster and a fan, and used to occasionally heckle some of the opposition players like Yorick and Skousen and people like that, and having a good, just basically enjoying it. Until we got to that point whereby we kind of started talking more, which culminated in the 2 hours on the night of the Milton Keynes defeat at the win anniversary, and then eventually we ended up travelling around the country together. He moved out. We had a flat in Newcastle, and he wanted to move out, and we were actually selling our house, moving to a new house, but we hadn't been able to sell our house yet. So we moved out, and I said, basically, why don't you just go and live in our old house, and you can pay, you can be my tenant. So he did that for about 18 months. And then the house, this was about 2010, 2011. And then we sold it. And the house that we'd moved into has a granny flat upstairs. And he really didn't want to go back to his flat in the centre of Newcastle for some reason. I have no idea. But he quite liked being out of the way in Gateshead. It's a bit further out of the way, a bit less going on. And my wife had a friend who'd been living upstairs, but she moved back home. And so we said, well, you may as well come and move upstairs. So he did, and he was a good, useful babysitter at regular times. And basketball players keep ridiculous times. Their body clocks, they're practicing 8 o'clock at night as they work, or 10 o'clock. So they might not be ready to go to sleep at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So he'd always be ready to do a midnight run if we hadn't got any milk for the baby or something like that. It was great having a kind of a compliant tenant upstairs. And the advantage of that was that, we got to talk. He kept himself to himself at times, but there's other times where we just talk about the game, talk about the team, and you're constantly kind of discussing ways of getting better and things that we need to do, and how the guys are, which players are feeling a bit down on themselves, what we think about the other teams in the league. It's a long way back from Copper Box to Newcastle on a bus, and there's only so many things you can talk to a basketball obsessed individual about. It's basketball. So that carried over to the court. It carried over to what people say on a game night.
What would you say are the biggest things that you learnt from working so closely with Fab over the best part of a decade?
The biggest things were the early things, the stuff that I was absolutely totally unaware of when I got there. I didn't understand. I had this kind of idea in my head that players were kind of what they were, that they were robots, that they would just turn up, they would do their job. If they were better than the other guy, they would win. If they were worse than the other guy, they would lose. So you get the most talent, you're going to win. And I soon learned that, the players are very, very sensitive individuals. And it's very much about understanding what makes the individual tick, particularly in basketball, particularly in the BBL, which is a kind of a mid-level league. So you have some players who are settled here. You have some players who are looking to pursue an agenda further up the tiers. You have lifers here. Then and understanding the mentality of somebody who was putting their job on the line every night, not for a tremendous amount of money, but because it was something that they wanted to do, and understanding how they ticked. That was the biggest thing, because he I think his greatest skill was his ability to understand and get into the heads of players, if that makes any sense. The psychology. He could tell if a player had a personal problem just by walking in the gym and looking at the way that he was warming up. And he'd be saying to me, Dave, he ain't right. And I'd be saying, what do you mean? He's just done a layup. And he'd come back and he wasn't right. There was something going on, whatever. And that kind of, taking away my side of it was always, I was always into numbers and teams and stats and league and all that type of stuff, and understanding what it takes, not just to get a good team, but to get the best performance when it mattered out of players, and to understand what's going on in the head and make sure they're all pulling in the same direction when you've got a group of very disparate individuals who are playing for disparate purposes. he taught us that a lot, and also the importance of being sincere. I mean, that is what I have to be in my job. I have an oath to the court, an oath to clients, etc. But the importance of just being straight with everybody and telling them what, and letting it out and telling them what he thought,
Yeah.
and being able to justify it.
I guess that's what because like I said, I briefly spoke to him, and one of the things he said in terms of topics, which I think is basically what you've just said, is asking about how to read the signs. How do you know who is there and who is not, and how to get them there.
Yeah,
that's it, right?
Yeah, that is it. And then you've also got, because you've got to be aware, and then you have to be aware of that in a game situation. So it was quite important that I kind of understood that, because if there was somebody who wasn't there mentally for whatever reason in the game situation, he'd be looking at me, either because he was on the bench and he wasn't playing, and he'd be saying to me, "Why ain't I playing? He ain't there." Or he'd be on the court saying, basically giving me the eyes, which are saying, "Get him out, get him, he ain't ready." And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but we still kind of need something from him, Fab, because Fab would happily play games with 5 players if he thought those 5 players were the right 5 players. Well, and he did that at Birmingham with Nigel. He had success with Nigel and Tony Sims and Reggie Kirk and the Fab Five at Birmingham. So he was always it was never about how many players you've got. It was about getting getting as many as you can on the same page and trusting each other and building a group as a result of that. And I think the sport's kind of gone away from that a little bit now with the sports science. It has to in the managing minutes and that type of stuff. But even then, we just won the trophy final in March with 6 players. And Darius playing 43 minutes, and Darius, and in 7 foot hasn't playing 41 minutes. So you can still win that way. It's just whether you've got the group is put together properly. So that's it, and also just probably the competitiveness. Just to be, we were always. I think I'm as competitive as he is. He wouldn't. I don't know if he would agree with that, but we're just very competitive in different ways. And having that competitiveness every game, to know that if you'd won the last game, it was actually more likely that you were going to be rubbish in the next game, because the BBL goes that way. Teams get comfortable. The team that's coming off a loss plays harder, and to try and see that before it happened and stop it happening, and get the right guys who have that consistency of approach to prevent it happening. So yeah, a lot of it was psychology with him.
The other thing he spoke about, and I think it's kind of relevant to a lot of the other stuff we want to get into, is kind of going from being, if you want to call it, a fan and sort of having all of these opinions, but then actually getting on the inside and seeing the reality of how things work and what is possible, what isn't possible. Can you kind of talk about that transition for you and maybe the biggest things, the biggest sort of opinions that were changed from your own personal standpoint, from when you went from the being in the stands to being on the side and actually seeing behind the scenes of things that work and don't work?
I think the biggest thing I had was a far greater appreciation of just how good these guys are, and how even people say, "Oh, the BBL this, the BBL that," to get a job, either as an American or as a British player in the BBL, you've generally been through a significant amount of college. You've played at a higher level in college. We signed guys from Notre Dame, from Seton Hall, first team, Horizon League players, whatever. And seeing them practice and seeing how committed they are to their craft was an eye-opener, because people don't see the practice and they don't understand the amount of work that goes in. And you're watching these guys shooting, in drills, and they're making 80 or 90% of their threes. They're unguarded, but even so, they are just at a different level to what people, I think, understand. So that was the first thing. Then there was an appreciation of all the stuff they did behind the scenes in relation to the community and the mentality that the players had, and it helped kind of bind the team together. So that was a change. And thirdly, I think, as a fan, you think you know everything on the basis of what you see. As a coach, you realize you know extremely little. In relation, you realize that the answers that you would have as a fan aren't necessarily the answers.
Yeah. It's
So
like,
I mean,
what's that law called? There's a law where like the more you know, the more you realise you don't know. So you actually, is it Dunning-Kruger effect? Or there's some.
I think it is something like that. Yeah, Ian's very good at that. That's McLeod. He knows all that stuff. But yeah, basically that's right. And you have to. I think the phrase is the known unknowns. You have to understand the known unknowns. You have to know what you don't know, and that's absolutely critical. And I'm not going to be able to tell Ramon Fletcher how to run the point. He's been doing it all his life. Or am I going to tell Fab how to play defense? Or I'm not. But what I can be there is a sounding board. I can stand there, and if people want to sound off or say something, or I can make suggestions as to how we can do things slightly better to suit the skills that the guys have got, and that type of thing. But in relation to I did once after about a year of being a coach. I did look back and think of all the times I previously thought he was wrong when I'd been a fan, and I think I reckon about a third of them I still think he was wrong, but the other 2/3 I think I kind of understood what was going on, and I figured it all out. Fab was famous at times for if a guy wasn't doing what he was doing, he would just play 5 guys. He would sit them on the end of the bench. He wouldn't play them. And to a fan, when your team's getting beat by 15 at home, that's like, what the heck is he doing? He's it's just crazy. But when you see it, you see the practices beforehand, and you understand the team dynamic. You understand why it's happening. So that really was an education. Not so much the last years, because we kind of figured it out by then, I think.
How frustrating do you find? I call you in jest the sort of the chief of defensive BBL Twitter. I know that if anyone is slandering the BBL on Twitter, I can go and look at the replies, and you'll be the first one in there. Giving an opinion and sort of, well, in many cases defending the BBL, which I think is great. And I think you're one of the few people that's uniquely placed to have an opinion across kind of all levels of the game, because you've been involved as a fan, but you've been involved, as an assistant coach, but you've also seen operationally, you're a trustee of the Eagles Community Foundation. You're involved at the grassroots level. You kind of have done a bit of everything, so to speak. You're qualified table official and all the other bits and bobs. Referee.
Qualified table official.
So yeah, like you come at it with a pretty broad spectrum of insight and experience. Like, I guess let's start with, what is your number one gripe that you have with people that are critical of the BBL? What's the number one criticism you see of the BBL that you believe is actually incorrect?
I try and answer anything. You're right what I say. I do come back at people at times. I try and do it primarily with facts as opposed to opinions. I always try and make sure there's a fact to justify the opinion. There are so many legitimate criticisms. Let's be blunt. There are things that we could do better, and it's when I think the most frustrating one for me is in relation to the level of play. I absolutely understand what the level of play in the BBL is. I've recruited teams for the last decade. I understand where it compares with basically every other league in Europe, because I've recruited players from looking at virtually every other league in Europe, and I've seen the ones that do well in the UK and the ones that don't do well in the UK. So I can tell you that if you're averaging 18 a game in Serie B in Italy, you're going to be doing fine. You'll do fine in the BBL. But I can also tell you that if you've played 20 games in Serie C, you're not going to be getting off the bench much, and I know that. And that, you can say that for basically every other league in Europe, German Pro A, German Pro B, whatever. That's in my head. That all that information is there. And what we tend to find is there is a level of it's always instructive to me that players who haven't played in the BBL don't really think much of it. But when they come to play in the BBL, the word is always, "Oh, this is better than I thought." Always. Or actually the standard isn't bad. And it isn't bad because we got, ultimately Justin Robinson. Obi was in the league last year. I appreciate it was one-off. Proper good level British players. Outside of the top 10 British players, probably top 15, we have basically the rest of the a significant amount of good British press. And the Americans we have, you're telling me that I'm signing a guy who was the captain of Notre Dame and averaged 10-6, Scott Martin, in a senior season at Notre Dame, and you're telling me that he's kind of the level of an equivalent kind of mid-level Division 2 player. It's like, no, he's not. He's better, and that's and so I think a lack of understanding, I think, just as to the level and what it takes to win in the league is probably my main gripe. If somebody undervalues the standard of the players that we have, then I will come back at them. No, I'm not.
Where do you think that criticism comes from? Like, if that is the perception, like what is it that's causing it? Is it everything else around the league? The fact that it doesn't get national media attention, the fact that some venues don't look great, like kind of what is causing that?
I think my guess is, and it's a guess, so I'm not going to seek to try and demonstrate a degree of insight that I don't have, but it's a guess. My guess is it's word of mouth. And we players who do well in college in America come back and aren't necessarily ready to play. I'm talking about British players come back and aren't necessarily ready to play in winning teams in the BBL. And what we tend to do is to undervalue the guys who've been in the league for a number of years and have won. I say word of mouth. It's also a problem that the reality is the BBL is not well represented in what are the hotbeds of basketball in this country. So Manchester has been up and down the BBL team. The Magic has been the primary program. The Giants have struggled over the past few years and ended with their venues. Hopefully things have changed now. They've got a new owner. Birmingham is a hotbed of basketball. Birmingham is lost to the BBL. That's a problem. Nobody in Birmingham is going to say I've had a good experience, because 20 years ago their club just was basically whipped away from them by a rogue owner, and it never came back in reality. London, and happily now this is changing, but if you look at the BBL within kind of a 50-mile radius of the M25, it's basically, other than the guys in Guildford who've done it on a number of different entities. So the Scorchers, the Heat, Surrey United, all of that stuff, they've changed around. It's taken Vince probably, 5, 6, 7 years to build any form of base in the copper box. Happily, he's there now, and that's great. But the BBL in that area is, in the kind of 50-mile radius outside of London, is just failed. And that's not a criticism of the people who kept it going, because Vince went to a shopping centre to play. He built his own warehouse. He's done everything he possibly could to keep that franchise going, and hopefully he's going to benefit from that now. Buy it. But if you're American, if you've got a kid coming back from college and he says, "Oh, can I play for the Lions? Where are you playing?" "Oh, we're playing in a shopping centre." That does not make the league look good. Be blunt. That's the way that gets around. And then you look at the fact that in reality, down in that kind of area, there are a number of upwardly mobile Division 1 clubs. So the Division 1 is Hemel and Sutherland down south, obviously, and Worthing down south, Division 1, and Leopard, Essex, all of that stuff, Westminster, all these clubs, and they've been manageable and workable, but the BBL really hasn't, until Vince has got to where he's got to now, hasn't worked. Even the Royals. The fact that we've not been able to run a club out of Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace, South London, and is the hotbed of British basketball. Obviously you run the Hoopsfix Classic there. Look at all the guys who have come out of it. Look at Justin, Matthew. You know them better than me.
Eric, yeah.
Now, if the reputation of the league is, that's why it was a massive thing. It was a massive thing for the league when Justin came back. If the reputation of the league is not good, the word gets around those people, and it's not understood. And to be fair, it isn't a good situation. It was great for us to be winning everything in Newcastle for donkey's years. It was fantastic. It's what we wanted to do, and we're doing it. But it doesn't add to the national exposure of the league.
Yeah.
If the trophy final is between Newcastle and Plymouth, then that isn't really going to send a good message to the young guys who are balling in Birmingham and Manchester. They're not exposed to it. They don't know it.
Where do you sit on kind of whose responsibility is for helping clubs develop? Like on a club development standpoint, you talk about upwardly mobile Division 1 clubs. And there's been obviously with what Solent did last season and looking like what they're going to do this season, it looks like in Division 1 everyone's playing for second place. But you look at Solent and they get to the BBL trophy final. There's a conversation there about, should they go to the BBL? Would they go to the BBL? And there has been debate about, well, what's the actual incentive for them to go to the BBL? Is there enough of an incentive for them to go to the BBL? Do you think that's where potentially there's an issue? It's like, well, if you're already filling your venue every week, if you're doing what you need to do to be profitable, and you've got the fans, like, because there isn't a national TV exposure, because there isn't a national media coverage exposure, like, how much are you going to grow as a result of being in the BBL? Like, and who is responsible for kind of helping these clubs and maybe advising these clubs on options to potentially help grow the league? Because that's the thing, especially Paul Blake, we always hear him talk about the fact you need more clubs. Like, you need more clubs. The league needs to be bigger,
That's absolutely right. That, if I may say, that's a hell of a good question. That actually gets to the nub of a number of different issues that we have. Primarily, the issue has always been the dichotomy between the Basketball England and the BBL in relation to the different styles of the league. You've got a franchise league, you've got a league run by a national organisation, a national governing body, sorry. In relation to the merits in going to the BBL, the only benefit in going to the BBL is if you've got an arena which you want to fill. So ultimately have a 400-seat, 500-seat gym. Worthing tried this. I mean, we were talking about this, but one of my truisms is that anything that is being discussed in the BBL will have been discussed 10 years ago, and it will have been discussed 20 years ago. And it will have probably been discussed 30 years ago. And it may have been done. And the answers will be there if you look back. Because what you're saying to me about Solent there is where Worthing were in 2009. They came up to the BBL in 2010. They had 2 seasons in the BBL, and they had to drop back down because there was ultimately financially not sustainable for them. And they were playing in Worthing Leisure Centre, which is probably one of the better NBL1 venues, or certainly was at the time. And we visited it often enough. We seemed to be down there every week when we were playing, and it was a long trip. But they couldn't make it work, and they had a decent team. They got to the playoffs. Certainly, I think the final. The coup de grace for them was when they had to come to Newcastle to play a one-legged playoff game at the end of the season, and we beat them. We were first, they were 8th. We beat them, and they're about £3,000 out of pocket, or something, because of the trip and etc. And so, if you don't have a venue that you can benefit from filling, it's very difficult to see, and that's where the answer to your question comes from. The responsibility in relation to more clubs comes down to more venues. That responsibility, from what I can see, it should be taken primarily by the national governing body to liaise and link with the funders to establish appropriate sites, to establish appropriate new build venues around areas where clubs can develop or where clubs are already developed. And I think Basketball England has done a lot of things very well over the past 20 years. Certainly the youth structure is so much different to when I was growing up. It's crazy. I think Basketball England is full of some very good people doing difficult jobs. But I think where they've failed more than anything else is in relation to providing support for the higher level, as it were, semi-pro teams. And the reality is that I know that there is some support offered kind of coming down from some of the BBL clubs on an individual basis, and that clubs are invited to put plans together and work with those plans, etc. And we've had success in relation to Bristol and Worcester, probably going back a bit further, coming up, who weren't necessarily successful programs in NBL1, but who are moving forward as clubs. But it seems to me that we need more clubs, and we need to have more clubs. We need more venues. And a venue doesn't have to be an enormous venue. It needs 1,500 seats. Ellesmere Port at Cheshire is a perfect example of it. Modern, it's airy, it's 1,500 seats. It creates a good atmosphere in there. It's perfectly plausible to have those type of venues all over the country, and we don't seem to have any form of national strategy to get them. And I think that's where we struggle. The venue up here, which I was intimately involved in as a trustee in Newcastle, that was 10 years of work for Sam and Paul. And probably if you go back to creating the climate within the community for the council to be interested, probably another 10 years of development before that. And there was limited support until a relatively late stage in relation to that project. If Sam and Paul hadn't wanted to do it, it wouldn't have happened. The fact we had a national basketball centre in Manchester, and we're only now 4 years on, got a team playing in it. That to me is incomprehensible. We need to be showcasing our best league. So there needs to be more cohesion between Basketball England and the BBL. I don't know enough about it to know what the issues are, or whether if there is blame or if there is difficulties, where those difficulties lie. I don't know enough about that. But we need a national facilities strategy, and that national facilities strategy has to involve professional clubs, because professional clubs create an economy for the sport. An economy for the sport means more people get jobs. The more people get jobs, the more interest there is. The more we can spend the sport.
Yeah, I think
it's a situation where Mark Strutle is a GB coach and he's having to coach in Division 3 because we've only got 11 pro teams and they've all got coaches.
Yeah,
but, it's just not sustainable. It can't be right.
Yeah,
There's a lot of problems.
As much as there needs to be more venues and facilities, the other thing is you need a strong club and an ambitious club to be based out of it. Otherwise, it's all a waste, right? And I think, when I think about some of the National League clubs, I don't know how many actually really do have ambitions of growing this thing as big as they can or want to do it, because ultimately, like you said, there really isn't that much of an economy for basketball in this country. Very much, the clubs are driven by volunteers, and as a result of that, it's a secondary activity on the side and not their primary thing. But it's it's double-edged sword. In terms of I know we've obviously discussed this privately, and I don't know how much you're willing to share, but in terms of sort of the tangible difference, let's talk pre-COVID. What that arena has meant to the Eagles. I know, like you said, like we've said, that you're obviously on the Eagles Community Foundation Trust board, so you kind of the figures and kind of what's going on behind the scenes. Can you discuss sort of the impact that arena has had to the club, what it means for your bottom lines, and when people talk about why we hear so many people within the BBL say the key is having your own facility?
The impact isn't actually, it was only just kicking in at COVID time, because we've been in there a year and there was lots of things that we needed to sort out. My side of the impact is on the community side, because it's about, as you said, building the economy for the sport. It provides us with a site in a relatively deprived area of the West End of Newcastle to have people involved in the sport, which is under our control and our ability to fund. Now, the example of it, the example I can give is that we have our community foundation runs 9, 10 or 11 junior clubs, I can't remember, and they all have at least one paid coach attached to them, so it's not entirely volunteer based. There's a staff, and 4 or 5 of that staff are full time. Once we moved into the new arena, I actually took over the running of the Central Venue League, which had been running out of a school in North Shields, and set it up so we could be using it. And our goal is to increase our number of members of all those clubs to 1,000. So we want to have 1,000 junior members playing basketball with a kit of their specific club, but with also the Newcastle Eagles Community Foundation on. By March of last year, we'd already reached 84 teams in our Central Venue League. We'd gone up from 49 to 84. We'd introduced an under-10 section, played across the court 4v4 and 8-foot baskets, and they just played 20-minute running clock and didn't keep scores or anything, or didn't keep league tables or anything like that. And we had 27 teams within 6 months of starting. That's 100. That's 100 plus under 10s playing every Sunday morning for at least an hour, and then going into their clubs or during the week and playing for at least an hour, hopefully more. Just like it is in football up here, just like it is in cricket up here. If you play the weekend, you practice during the week. We never had that in basketball up here because we never had the facility or the ability to do it. And if you don't introduce the kids at an early stage to the opportunity to play, and not just kind of go into a school once and then 6 months later somebody else goes into a school, that's no good. You have to get them into the sport whereby they are playing and they are attending to play the next, and then they've got a practice session and they've got games the next week and games the next week and games after that. And you have to do that from the age of 7 or 8 because that's what football does and that's what cricket does and that's what rugby does. If you can do that, you can build an economy for the sport because the parents bring the kids along, the parents buy the gear, the parents buy the equipment, and the kids who maybe don't like football or don't like rugby, they've got their sport. And then you've got then the child is there and the parent is there, and then we all got to do is provide the service. And that's what we were getting to. And that's where it changes everything. Because those kids are the kids who then buy the tickets for the games. You know, we have to educate the kids because the parents are beyond the education. They don't see the sport. The kids don't see the sport on the television. It's not like they watch Match of the Day and watch the analysis. When I was growing up, I had all the old satellite boxes. I had Screen Sport to try and find Kingston's games in Europe. You know, I remember the 1989 European Championships were on some ridiculous satellite program with Lithuania and Sabonis and Yugoslavia and Divac beating the crap out of each other. You know, I remember those games. But we don't. The kids don't have that, and so we have to almost force feed it to them, and we have to make it accessible, and we have to make it child friendly, and we have the great advantage at the arena where we have a balcony, so the parents aren't anywhere near the court, so all the parents are on the balcony away from the court, and the kids, and we have the baskets on the sides of the courts as well, so the kids can play across the court. But building the economy, the more kids that play, the more coaches we can employ. The more, we just set up our membership. We set up a membership scheme a week ago online for our junior members, and they get discounts as part of the teams as well. They pay an annual membership of £30. They get a basketball, they get their insurance, they get various other things as well. And they can't practice with us until they're annual members. And we set that up last week on the Eagles website, and within a week we've got 430 signed up. You know, and these are the numbers that change things. We want to get to 1,000. Ultimately, by the end of this year, we'll probably be at 750, because they bring parents and grandparents. That's building an economy, and that's what we need more of across the sport. And that's why the venue is so important, because it allows us to do that. It allows us to store our equipment. It allows us to sell pop in sandwiches and stuff like that. In relation to the professional game, obviously it's a great help, but the professional game itself isn't going to build an economy for the sport. You know, the economy is jobs, and jobs come from participation as much as anything else. In the professional game, ultimately, every professional team is going to try and win. So the more revenue we raise, the more we can pay the players, which is good, because everybody involved in the BBL is underpaid for what they provide. Not just players, referees, staff, coaches. Everybody's underpaid as far as I'm concerned for the effort of having seen it close hand over 10 years for what they put into their craft and what they put into their sport. So we do need to do that. But we've all seen what happens if you just come along with a check and say there's 600 grand. You know, we see the London City Royals. Mm. No, I'm not being. That's the truth of it. There's no economy for the sport there, and that's not a criticism of anybody who took the money or anybody who joined that club because they were told one thing and another thing happened. Mm. But it's not. It's in no way long way sustainable. So that's why the venue is so critical. Yeah. It focuses everything around a central point.
Yeah, it's funny you say. I always remember having a conversation with the Royals owner after it kind of all went to pot, and the first thing he said was that we did it the wrong way around. We thought we could build from the top down rather than the bottom up. And if I was to do it again, I would have done it the other way. So that was super interesting. There were two things you said there that are the two. If I was to talk about, I don't know if you remember a few months ago, I've put a thing on Twitter about the biggest opportunities in British basketball, and in terms of like lowest risk, highest reward, because obviously the whole thing is like, yeah, facilities, of course, but that the infrastructure, the money that requires is massive. But when we're talking about opportunities to be able to really drive things forward, there are two that I see that are pretty obvious. One is the membership side of the game, which you spoke about there, about making sure you've got your players that are registered with the club before they can then take part in sessions, and that I would like to see from a governing body standpoint, where they really incentivize membership in a much bigger way, so that, for example, someone like me who's not a member should be a member, and they can use those numbers as leverage when you're talking about raising money, whether it's commercially or also with from the government. That's one. And then the second one is mini basketball and sort of the under-10s, where there just really isn't much provision at all. And I always think, for any young player coming up, the issues are basically just where you're going to play. Like, where are there sessions to play kids of my age? Like, if I was to put that question to you, when you're talking about opportunities, lowest risk, highest potential reward, sort of the biggest leverage points to really drive basketball forward as a whole, like, what would you say?
Well, you're absolutely you nailed on. It's under 10s, without a shadow of a doubt. When I mentioned before, I coached football in America. When I came back from America in about 2001, I became involved in the old community association. It was a boys' club that I used to play football for in Gateshead. And at that point, mini soccer was just starting in Gateshead. And up until that point, kids had been playing 11-a-side at the age of 7, and and it wasn't really very sensible. And so mini soccer was starting, and I'd seen how it worked in America because they were ahead of us. And we came back, and me and a few others, we instituted quite a significant mini soccer approach, revolution almost, in Gateshead, based out of our club. We ran the Central Venue League out of our club. We ended up with 20 under-10s teams at our club, just at one club. We just basically had kids come along and play. And it invigorates the whole club. It invigorates the whole side, because you don't just have... Because once you get to 12, the kids come if they want to come. Up until 12, the kids bring entourages. They bring parents, they bring grandparents. They all want to be part of something. The parents want to see that the kids are fitting in and belong to something, and therefore... the opportunities there. And football, and to a certain degree rugby, and particularly up here, football is just enormous. I mean, football is just gigantic, to the point that when we've fixed our CVL days, we play under 12s and up on a Saturday because they play football on a Sunday, and we put under 10s and down on a Sunday because they play football on a Saturday. So we want to give it's actually that much thought went into it. So the invigoration you get of having an influx of kids at the age of 6 or 7, when they don't know what sport they want to play. They don't know if they want to play any sport at all. Basketball is such a fantastic child-friendly sport because it allows the kids, you only need a ball and a hoop, and it allows the kids to have success almost immediately, throwing the ball through the hoop. That's it. It's not a situation like football where they might be in a game and one big kid might be running past everybody and the other little kids are on the sideline. And also, basketball is a sport you can basically practice one-on-one as much as you want with a ball and a hoop. And the look of success and the look of joy on parents' faces when the kids come out smiling, and the look when the kid makes his first layup, or just on a short, and they have that sense of belief in themselves, you can get them. And if you get the kids at 7 and 8, then it comes to be a question of, can you get you're getting the right athletes in your sport, and also you're getting a pyramid beneath that of people who are helping build an economy for the sport, because out of the interested parents, you can train up coaches, you can train up referees, you can train up volunteers, all sorts of stuff, which you can then supervise to continue to build that economy. And it doesn't work half-hearted. It doesn't work. One of the first things I did for the foundation 5 years ago when my son was 6, we didn't do any. Our foundation runs a fantastic Hoops for Health program, but that was always year 5, so 10-year-olds. And I said, well, why aren't we doing anything for the year 2s, year 1s and year 2s? So what we instituted a program called Little Dribblers. I actually coached the first few sessions of it. Went up to the school. We basically school had to. It was an after school club, so the kids did have to pay a little bit. I had to pay £2.50 a session like they do for all the other after school clubs. And part of it was that the school was provided with 2 hoops, 7-foot or 8-foot hoops or whatever, and a bag of mini basketballs, and that stayed with the school. So we just came up, 15 kids signed up to stay for an extra hour, and we played with them. And then from that, we feed them into the club, which is based at the secondary school up the road. And so they then has to come into the club. And at that point, the need is then, well, what are they going to get out of the club? And the answer is, well, you're going to get coached a little bit more. You're going to get told about the footwork of the sport. You're going to have to be there every week. We expect, that there's only so many space, so you have to be committed to it. And you're going to get to play games every weekend. Now, the games aren't of much level, because it's a familiarization. It's not about, finding the next LeBron James at age 7. But from a couple of years of familiarization that they get at years kind of when they're 7, 8, and 9, means that you've got a chance when they decide they want to be good at the age of 10 and 11 to get them into the proper system and to get them coached and to have them playing like that. Doncic was playing for Real Madrid at 11, something like that. He was, or 13. He's playing under 16s basketball at 11. You just have to get them early, and you have to get, and then you can build. So we've now got merchandise pages for our clubs. So the club that my brother runs is Cardinal Hornets. It's got 180 members. Had 13 under-10s teams last year. They've got a merchandise page on Hoopsfix, whereby they can get water bottles and kit and training tops and all sorts of stuff, and gradually trying to kind of build the economy that way. But I'm with you. That is it, and that I think is the. If there were two failings of the governing body, I think one is putting forward realistic competitive structures. I say competitive, realistic opportunities for under-10s to play. And I'm talking about 7-year-olds here. And secondly is in relation to the adult clubs who need to be pushed on a bit further, which we talked about before.
When we're talking about criticisms of the Newcastle Eagles programme, one of the ones which we've had multiple discussions, I've spoken about with Paul as well, is that it's clear that you've got, loads of kids playing at a grassroots level, but actually when it comes to talent development, we're not seeing kids coming out of the northeast area to go on to play high levels. I think I had a brief look, but there's obviously, I'm trying to think in the time that I've been around, there was Ross Wilson who went Division 1, and obviously I don't think he's playing anymore. And then in the BBL at the moment, Jordan Nichols down at Bristol, right? I think as well
No, Jordan was primarily Teesside, to be fair.
That wasn't Newcastle. Okay, but that okay. So like
basically, there's you're absolutely right. There is Eddie Matthew. And he came to our program.
Yeah.
And Tozan.
Oh, and Tozan, of course. Yeah, of course, Tozan. So why are we not seeing more talent come out of the Newcastle Eagles program? When we talk about junior development, elite development, like what do you think it is that's not allowing you guys to create more talent coming out of the area?
It's a very good question. It's one that I've set myself a task of solving. My initial view is that it is because we don't get the kids early enough. We never did. We started National League under 14s. Our CVL started at under 12s, but we didn't make any significant effort because of the strictures of space that we had in relation to the venue places where we were going to kind of mass market at 7, 8, 9-year-olds to get the kids at a younger age group. I don't think it is as much to do with the pathways. I think the pathways have improved over the past few years, but the reality is that up until probably Ross, which is one you did, the reason we got Ross was because he went to a Hoops for Health session at Gosforth High School when he was 10, and he got involved in the sport, and he happened to be an athletic freak, and you would accept that. He was 6'7", athletic, and he was a high level athlete. We didn't get Ross because he had a basketball in his hand when he was 7, and he was dribbling the basketball around everywhere he went. We didn't. So we've been limited we've been limited in reality to kids who have been late starters, which means you're limited to athletes.
And that's the same as the rest of the country though as well, right?
Yeah. It is limited to athletes, and we don't have it. I think we've not had the athletes because we haven't got them into sport quick enough, and they've all been playing football. If I'm honest. Beyond that, I think the fact that Mac's been in charge of the academy for 3 or 4 years, and he's now the head coach, and that helps its way through. I think I would be disappointed if we don't have more coming through in the near future. We've got Leo Leperrier, under 16. He's playing for his England squad. Yemisi, I can't remember Yemisi's second name. There's a girl who's in the under 15 squad who's very, very good. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we need out of the number. It's kind of our next step. We build the economy, but then we have to do a better job at, I think. And we actually talked about it. We're starting an under 11, under 12 development squad this year, of picking out of those 9 and 10-year-olds, the kids who have the potential to go further and to subject themselves to more intensive practices, and to develop it that way. I mean, but I do think that our systems over the last few years are a lot better than they were, and unfortunately, we're still a little bit damned by, basically 10 years where we were telling everybody how many kids we had, but we weren't producing any players, and that was the truth. But even now, Temba Yabantu, who's on the bench of the BBL team, Temba played for Ian at Gateshead College, played throughout our academy under 16s. Temba's got a chance. He's his third year now. He's getting stronger. He's getting better. I don't know. We expect him to be able to contribute at some point. And so I suppose the answer is we've got to do a bit better. But I know how we're going to do better. I know how we're going to make it better. And I know that with the venue that we've got no excuse not to. In the past, there were excuses because you have to get the bodies in the build. You have to get the bodies in the gym to pay the wages. We can't pay the wages. We can't maintain basketball. So it became and so the secondary part of that, which is, the fact that the best players in the country will generally come out of very concentrated programs whereby they only have 10 or 20 kids, and they're kind of whittled down, and they have trials every year, and kind of that elite level development. It's very difficult to run both participation and elite at the same time. It's possible, but generally and then to run participation, elite, and pro at the same time, I don't think anybody's ever done that successfully in the UK. Because you look at the best participation and junior elite programs like Manchester or Birmingham, the Magic, for instance. Magic always took the considered decision not to go pro because they didn't want it to impact upon the stuff that they were doing for the kids, which is fine. It's great. It's what they do for the kids is great. But I don't think it's ever really been accomplished in any organisation, and that's the target we've set ourselves. And that's really to be honest, it's kind of one of the reasons that I was quite comfortable stepping down, because I know there's stuff to do.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I don't know if you saw. Obviously, Barking Abbey just announced there's a partnership being formed formally with the London Lions.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. You look at the Lions now, with UEL as well, and then you've got the WBBL side, and then now you've got the academy sort of formally linked. I think it's going to take a little while. I don't see there being immediate changes, but you're gone.
No, it always takes a while, and the problem is developing players is unless you get kind of the player who is, as I say, either an athletic level, which obviously Ross was, and to a certain degree Tozan was. Tozan's a very smart kid, or a kid like Eddie who is just basketball 150%, who would bounce the ball and sleep if he could. What we have to do a better job of is creating kind of that second layer, that base to the pyramid of kids who may not be, every good team in Europe has a homegrown point guard. They all have their point guards coming through the system, the Europeans. And we've always struggled to produce guards in this country. And if there haven't been people who've had specific links with coaching greats in this country, so, you're talking Justin is Jimmy Rogers and Brixton. You're talking Andrew Lawrence is obviously his family. His family is weight in basketball. Even Dan Clark, his family is basketball. If you go through that, then suddenly all our GB guards are coming in from America. We're not. I think probably outside of Teddy,
Luke Nelson's dad as well.
Luke Nelson, Steve Nelson, when he played at Sunderland, when Luke Nelson's there as well. There's a link between an interest, and if you go down in the junior setups, you'll see Nate Robinson is part of the GB setup. Well, he's Mark Robinson's son. He used to play EPL, and
that's interesting.
It's interesting. It actually carries across many sports, because if you look at cricket now, and particularly, a lot of cricketers come out of families of cricketers, Stuart Broad, Chris Broad, or from private schools as well. And the reason for that is because what we haven't done is developed kind of a coterie of kind of 10 or 15 point guards at any spot, in any age group, who can then fight amongst each other to get to the top. And most of the kids that we send abroad are athletes. That's the reality of it. That's the reality. So that's something that probably has to be changed. How it's changed, I don't know. But we're going to try. It's probably definitely
the other thing I've got to ask is, again, if we're talking about criticisms, is and you've kind of alluded to the fact that Tafari Tony was one of the first players that you saw, and you realise his mum was born in England, is the fact that a lot of the Brits on the Eagles rosters that we see are in fact American developed, that have access to a passport in some way. Kind of, where do you sit in terms of how much that potentially could hinder the game, in terms of not having spots for true Brits, if you want to call it that, like Brits that have been developed through the British system, and kind of, what's your opinion sort of on that whole, I guess, plastic Brit is the term that was used in the run up to London 2012, on that whole debate?
I'm a lawyer, and I think it's nonsense. If I'm honest, I think it's absolute nonsense. I think Kevin Peterson played for England, probably England's greatest ever cricketer. Andrew Strauss was born in South Africa. Matthew Pryor was born in South Africa. I don't accept the concept that I accept the concept of international law, which means if you're British, you're British, and I don't accept the idea that there's a difference between a true Brit and a British person who was born in America with a British mother. I think you're just as British as if you were otherwise. That's what the law says. I don't agree with I don't agree with discrimination within the law, and there's no. And it's a futile. To be blunt, it's a futile argument anyway, because we are all governed by the law of the land, and the law of the land is that you cannot discriminate against somebody with a British passport.
Oh, of course, but it's about an ethos, right? Like, and if I'm a young British player, I am going to relate and be inspired by a player that has come through and gone through the same things that I have, as opposed to a player that potentially has never even stepped foot in England but has access to a passport and comes over here to sign a pro contract, right? Like, even if you take me, I'm half French, I've got a French passport, I can speak French, I can get by, but I definitely wouldn't class myself as French as a person that has been born and lived in France the whole time, and I could see why, if I was to represent the French national team, true French people might have an issue with that and feel like I'm an outsider or not necessarily like French developed or whatever. Like, do you not see that it potentially impacts how younger kids can look at the pathway and see whether or not there are opportunities for them?
Do you think that the West Indian kids of West Indian descent in the UK, of Caribbean families, of Windrush families, what do you think they think of Jofra Archer? You think they're inspired by him? What do you think the Muslim kids think of Moeen Ali? I don't. It's right to say, and you do have a point, because it's right to say that our fans like Eddie Matthew because Eddie's from up here.
Exactly.
We do like him, and that is a legitimate point. But international sport now is such that it's played by the rules, and it's wrong. I think Owen Hargreaves played for Manchester United, played for England in World Cups. He's German Canadian. He's picked for England. Declan Rice is a player playing for England at the moment. He's Irish. Nobody says that they're not inspired by. I don't. My view is, and this is probably something that I've probably got from Fab, although I had it beforehand as well, is that you want a job, you be better than the other guy. Basketball is ultimately, and every other sport, it is meritocratic.
Oh, of course.
But
Yeah. I don't deny that. I'm just saying about it's. I think it's more potentially. It's not about law and what you can and can't do under the precipice of the rules. It's more about like what potentially is the wider impact of that. Like I think it's very hard for anyone to argue that if Cameron Hildreth made the NBA, that would make a much bigger difference for British kids than OG Anunoby playing in the NBA. Like I don't think that's even a debate. And to say that they're exactly the same, I just think that's just not even close to being true.
Yeah, no, I agree with you absolutely. I do think that would be, and also we saw even that with Roald Dahl. Best paid British sportsman probably in history. Maybe Lewis Hamilton's different, I don't know, but he could have walked down the high street and no one would know who he was. Someone like Pops who played in the NBA, who was a superstar. As far as I could see, I watched him in Newcastle playing a game. He's a superstar. Yeah, people wouldn't know who he was. I get that, but I think it's an argument that we're very much in danger of over-egging, and because it's just not the way the world works. When you're dealing with professional level sport, it's not the way the world works, and ultimately we're going to sign guys. And to be fair, I mean, it's what you did say is we criticised because we're saying Americans with British passports. Well, if you go back through the last 15 years since I've been involved, who was the first team to sign Andrew Sullivan, Newcastle? Who was the first team to sign Richard Midgley, Newcastle? Who was the first team to sign Olu Babalola, Newcastle? Who brought Darius Defoe from Hackney, Newcastle? Who gave Andrew Bridge a shot, Newcastle? Who signed OJ, Olan Jackman, Newcastle? There's not many. I've got a list in my head of every British player who's out there who is available, and who brought Joe Akinwin back from college and signed him, Newcastle. Who brought Andy Thompson back from France and signed him, Newcastle. It's I don't think it's a fair criticism at all. I've got basically a list of every English player in my head, and if an English player who came through the English system wants to be paid £5,000 more than an English player with an American with an English passport who didn't, of the same ability, then it's unrealistic to suggest we're going to be paying £5,000 more for a player simply because he came through the British system. That's the reason.
So if the player was willing to accept less money for their counterpart, would that become a different conversation where you think that then you would end up with? Do you think that is potentially the sticking point?
My starting point, well, it was interesting because my starting point when recruiting was basically that, yeah. I would always look at it as it were Indigenous players first, because the advantage of having Indigenous players off the court, insofar as they're aware of they're not a risk, if I can put it that way. You know what you're getting. They know what it's about. If they've been in the league before, if you bring somebody over from the States or from anywhere else, that's a risk. So there's kind of an inbuilt advantage in having those players, and I've just listed I've given you a whole list of the ones that we signed. But ultimately, I also had an American player coach, American Brit, who was comfortable with signing American guys as well because he knew where they'd come from. So. The reality is that there are not that many Indigenous British players who come through our systems who are in our price range. So I'm not saying they're not good enough. I'm not saying that at all. But who are in our price range, and we don't overpay, and we've never overpaid. And I think Andy Thompson did a podcast with Mark Woods yesterday where he suggested that. One of the reasons he went to France was because they offered him money that we couldn't get near. And we would have loved to keep Andy, at the time he was at his peak. But there are a few Indigenous players that we haven't signed that we could sign. We've just signed Louis Sayers this year from Cheshire. Eddie is back as well. And so the pool we signed Will Saunders last year. As an available player once London Royals went down. So the pool of players who are within our price range, who we think are at the level within our price range where they can help us win, and not just play at the bottom of the league, but help us be at the top of the league, is limited. No, there aren't as many as you might think there are. The ones that in theory can definitely help us win aren't in our price range.
Mm. Yeah.
You know, so we can't pay what London were paying those guys. What not London, what the Royals were paying those guys. We'd love to.
Yeah.
Absolutely love to, or what the Turkish money is paying to Plymouth at the moment, or what Vince is able to recruit. I'd love to sign Byron Mullins. We can't afford him.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
That's fair enough. I'm aware of time, but just bringing some present day stuff. Obviously, speaking about recruitment there and player salaries and budgets and stuff. I would like to ask because you're privy to what's going on behind the scenes at the Eagles, with COVID going on, the pandemic this season. Like, what's your kind of take on? Well, first of all, I'd be interested to kind of hear what's your take on the British basketball economy, the British basketball league economy in terms of player budgets, salaries, whether or not there has been a noticeable drop in what you're paying guys, and how much it's going to change the landscape potentially, and then what you think the chances are we're going to have of seeing the season through without some major issues with lockdowns. We saw Eagles announce 2 days ago the fact that your test game is going to have reduced capacity. Like, it's issues like that potentially are going to cause problems throughout the season. And like we've seen many people say in the run up to this year was that if teams can't play with fans, the league essentially isn't viable. Like, I would just kind of your take on COVID and the impact that it's going to have on the BBL this coming year.
It's a hell of a good question. Well, as we speak, there's a meeting going on in government about sports. In relation to, I think the Football League are pushing. The Football League are pushing for fans to be allowed in because they're saying we're not economically viable if we can't have fans in the ground. From October onwards, that's what they're saying. I think the rugby union clubs are the same. They're saying that. There was a story yesterday. Saracens general manager saying that if we're restricted to 2,500 people in the ground, we'll not survive. And we can't run. I'll say we'll not survive, but we can't run. So for basketball, you have to think it's pretty difficult. That said, the advantage we have is that we aren't a high cost based sport. That the primary cost of the sport is the players and the housing of the players and the salaries of the players. Obviously, the players' contracts will be subject to various clauses in relation to COVID, which, to be honest, I don't know, but they will be if things go wrong. But I think the league's doing the right thing in trying to start and trying to maintain an economy for the sport and trying to give people jobs and players jobs as a result. How it will pan out, I mean, we don't. It's Wednesday afternoon now. The game is at the arena on Friday. I've just been at the arena this morning. We don't know if it's going ahead or not. We've not been told it's not, so we're planning that it is. But we're fully aware that any time in the next hour or 2 hours or day, they may say we have to play behind closed doors, or they may say we can't play at all. We just don't know, and we can't know because it's a public health decision, and public health decisions aren't taken by people who run sports clubs. So if you kind of look at that kind of level of difficulties for one game, then you start talking about a whole season. They exponentially increase. So where we're going to be, I don't know. In relation to the economy of the sport, in relation to the kind of the wages and stuff, I don't think it had a massive impact. It was unfortunate. We lost about 5 home games, I think, as a result, which would have been income. However, a lot of the players were able to be paid by way of the furlough scheme, so there wasn't a significant debt that way. The clubs don't really have much in the way of standing assets, if I can put it that way, which are depreciating while nothing's happening. And we obviously have our issues with the arena. Well, that's a community foundation thing as opposed to a club thing that has to be dealt with separately. But in relation to simple club things, most of the clubs run on relatively limited costs, and the primary costs will be salaries, and they've been furloughed. So the issue then comes as to whether or not at the end of the furlough scheme, if we can't play games, what happens? Now, there's 2 or 3 different ways around it. One is you do what ice hockey does and you cancel the season. You say, sorry, we've tried, but we can't. that would be regrettable, unfortunately, I think. The second is to say, well, we think we can manage this safely with a certain amount of people in the stands. Our arena at the moment is COVID friendly up to a remarkable degree in relation to one-way systems and everything. And I walked into a different place this morning. Haven't been in there for a while. So that's a feasible way out of it. In relation to some of the other clubs, the arenas in the BBL aren't actually as bad as people make them out to be. When you actually look at some of the arenas that people are playing in and some of the capacities, they're relatively substantial. Even probably the hardest one would be maybe Bristol, in relation to socially distancing. They don't have that much space. But outside of that, then we think we could get 1,000 in the Eagles arena quite comfortably with maintaining current social distancing rules, and that'll be similar for Leicester. And obviously the Copper Box is enormous, and Plymouth and Ellesmere Port and Sheffield, they're all upwards of 1,000 people, which means that you would hope that we could get 400 or 500 people in every venue, and you'd hope that would be sufficient to keep things ticking over until hopefully we can get more people in. And so I think they're doing the right thing in trying to play, in trying to run it, but it's everybody has to be very understanding about the problems of supporters.
Worst case scenario, if the season is cancelled, do you think we could be at risk of seeing any clubs or even the league go bankrupt? Or do you think because of the fact they're so used to running so lean, it's just a case of everything being paused, people finding other jobs to do in the meantime, and then when it comes back, everything just kind of starts up again?
I think that's actually probably a fair analysis. I really do. The issue with the issue that COVID has showed is that the reason that people are playing behind closed doors is to make sure they don't have to pay back TV money. So the reason football and rugby and cricket are putting all this expense into playing these games is because, and the NBA as well in particular, is because they know that if they don't fulfil their TV contracts, that they're going to be millions of pounds in the red, and many of those millions of pounds will already have been spent.
Yeah.
So that's why they're playing. If they didn't have those TV contracts, then I'm not sure they would be playing. But they do. Now, we don't have any. That's the thing. We don't have any TV money to. I think we have a deal with Perform. I think which we had to play with one of the reasons why the trophy final was probably played, because to deal with that. But we don't have anything outstanding in relation to liability, and that means that we basically only spend what we get.
Yeah.
We're kind of a zero sum point, and so I wouldn't see an issue. I mean, the knock-on issue would be possibly lots of club sponsors and stuff like that. That would be stuff you'd have to deal with on a local level. But basketball is in this country is one of the things it's knocked for is that there's an insecurity of employment, etc., and insecurity of teams. But it's a massive economic advantage that we get to redraw our salary. We get to redraw our playing budget every year.
Mm.
And it's a advantage in relation to business continuity. So if you write the contracts the right way, and then you're only looking at backup staffs of a few people who hopefully can be kept going, and potentially if we can get some TV income from games, it'd be even better. The reality is that sports are funded three ways: TV income, governing body income, and local club income.
Yeah.
And governing body income is, for instance, like Wimbledon for tennis, or the Lord's Test match for the cricket. That money gets dispersed to the counties, or the England matches through the FA. TV income is TV income, prize money is prize money, and then it's local clubs. And our economy is based entirely on what we generate. But we don't. But hopefully the clubs are sensible enough now that you're not spending what you don't generate.
How important do you think a TV deal is for the future success of the league and the visibility of the league and the growth of the sport, I guess, in the country?
I've really kind of vacillated on this over the years. There's times I thought it was really absolutely critical, and I've never been more excited than on Monday night gone when my name popped up on Sky Sports News. By the way, as having left the Eagles, on the ticker at the bottom, I've never seen. I literally jumped 12. I got a text. I spent 45 minutes watching the ticker to see my name come up and took a screenshot. So from that perspective, if that's me just seeing my name on the screen, imagine what it does to players and fans to see the games on the telly and all of that. I think the reason I vacillated on, the reason I'm not sure is because ultimately the numbers aren't great. You know, it gives off a fantastic impression if it's done properly. And one of the things you've had a bee in your bonnet about quite properly is the quality of the footage, which is you're absolutely 100% right on because of the impression it gives off. I'm also, on the other hand of it, versed in the business side of it, which says that even when it's on, not that many people watch. You know, and does it, you know, and so it's all cost benefit. And I suppose, I think my view is I think on a balance, we need to be on the TV. We need to be on preferably Sky Sports because ultimately that's what sports is now. Sky Sports or BT Sports, because you don't get sports on BBC One, BBC Two with any degree of any type of sport. We need to have that foothold on there to give us a little bit of credibility with sponsors. It's not an easy foothold to gain. Ice hockey's never had it either. And ice hockey is a comparable sport, but played in a bigger arena with more people in. So it's not easy, but I'm confident that the product we have is really good enough to actually warrant it. And I'm kind of frustrated that some of the players that we've had in our league over the years haven't attained the degree of notoriety or knowledge or haven't had any buzz around them. There's yet another counter argument to that, and this is me being a lawyer. I'm stacking up the arguments one side of the other. The other counter argument to that is it TV or is it that what we need to do is to build better narratives on digital media in relation to discussion programs, in relation to analysis programs. You see all this stuff that's come out during the lockdown. There are a lot of people who have legitimate viewpoints and can educate, because the biggest thing about basketball in this country and the development of it is that there are no educators visible. You know, you don't have Alan Shearer or whoever it is on explaining what's happened. You don't. We have to wait till 4 o'clock in the morning to watch Shaq and Charles and Kenny Smith giggling on about something or other in a kind of a way. But even then, we don't see the build-up pro. We don't see the build-up. We don't see much of see a little bit of telestrator. That's it. You've got to be really keen to look at it. So we don't build up narratives around players. And obviously, to be fair, the BBL, just before we stopped for COVID, they got Selena Conroy in, who's now, for the first time, they've got somebody who's in charge of that.
Yeah.
So the argument to say that in many ways, in catering to your own audience, is even more important than the Sky Sports stuff. But from everybody prefers it. Everybody has the impression of it being great if it's on telly. And my view is that is probably worth something.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, tough one though. You probably know more about it than me.
So we're gonna wrap up, but just some I guess some quicker questions to wrap up with, looking back on your time on the sidelines, starting with the sort of standout memories. Like, what are your standout memories from your time as an assistant coach with the Eagles?
I won a game in Glasgow when Fab was in hospital with bacterial pneumonia, and we didn't know if he was going to live or die. And Joe Chapman, he was in hospital in the infectious diseases wards in the RVI for 12 days, and struggling to breathe halfway through the season. And then we played Cheshire on the Friday night with 7 players, and Joe Chapman tore his Achilles in the middle of the court at Sports Central without anybody being anywhere near him. And then we went to Glasgow, who hated us, and they were top of the league and we were second. And went there with 5 players, and Andre Lockhart and Aaron Nielsen. And we were 15 points down, and Trey Moore and Charles Smith come back and won the game. And I've never been as high in my life. That must have been what drugs was like, because for 15, it was just like, that was 2010, 2011, so I was about a year in. Then winning stuff, the first final at the O2, I'm on the floor, in my suit at the O2, my mum and dad are in the crowd, and 15,000 people watching me on the sidelines of a basketball game. That's like crazy. The game at the arena where we beat Plymouth to win the trophy, the only 2-legged trophy ever, was not the arena at Sports Central was as loud as it's ever been. It was packed. At that point in time, you could not say that. People don't get this. Is the thing. It wasn't even on telly, so you don't know. But the night that it was, you couldn't say that was anything other than prime sporting theatre. We were down 9 points after the first leg, and we came back and won by 12 or 14. And finally, probably the opening of the arena. That first night, even though we lost, there was a point, and it happened. We talked about it afterwards with the kind of guys who've been around for a long time. But there was a point for me. It was about 3 minutes before the tip-off, when all the seats were full, when people had all streamed, because we had like every dignitary in the northeast was there. There was like 300 people in the corporate area, and they all came tumbling down, and it was on. And I just looked around, and the lighting's really good in the arena, so the lights were off over the crowd, and it had a little tear, just a little one. Like, Jesus, we did it. And I know that speaking to other people afterwards, they had the same thing, albeit at different times of the night. There was just a moment where you just look around and think, wow, I've been involved in basketball in the Northeast for like 33 years since I went to Gateshead Leisure Centre to watch Gateshead Vikings or McEwen's Tyneside when I was 11. And look at what we've managed to accomplish. That was as special as it gets. Outside of that, it's just lots and lots of trips up and down the motorway with Fab. Because what happened is when we're on the bus, the team sits at the back, and me and him and Eric, the team manager, and latterly Ian as well, we're at the front. So we get to whisper, and every so often we get to shout one of the players back down the front of the bus to tell them what they're doing wrong. And it's just, just constantly talking about basketball, reviewing the game, working out why decisions were made, kind of the science of it all, just kind of trying to figure out the world. That was it. That was thoroughly entertaining, and that's something I'll always, you build a camaraderie that you really enjoy. Sorry, there's about 5 answers.
The best player that you've coached?
Ooh, that's harsh. Best or most talented? Oh, goodness. If I was to say the very, very most talented player that we had at the Eagles, I think it was probably Jay Sean Page. I think Jay Sean was probably more talented than any in relation to talent he had in his little finger. Anybody else? In relation to best players, I don't really coach Drew Sullivan, so Drew doesn't count because he was with us for about 3 months. So I wouldn't be fair to include Drew. Obviously, he's incredibly talented. Probably has to be Charles, I think. Probably has to be Charles Smith. I mean, Charles is just that's best in relation to pure talent. Charles and Fab, when they played, were like the absolute perfect combination because Fab would defend anybody and throw the ball to Charles wherever Charles wanted it, and Charles would score. And, and we won 20 trophies off the back of it. But Charles's ability to come in the big games and make play after play when it mattered. And that he had a cussedness about him where he says at times where we're not going to lose. I think he would probably be the one. But it's hard because, Fletcher's awesome, I've had Fletcher 4 years. And Darius's commitment and stability and stickability is incredible as well. So they all brought different things, but best on a pure talent and willfulness level, I think Charles.
The best player that you've seen in the BBL, not necessarily from the Eagles, but in the league in your time.
In my time on the bench or in my time in history?
Let's do both. Let's do history. Start with history and then do your time on the bench.
The best player, most talented. The best player was probably either Amici or Maya, given what they accomplished. So John Amici obviously was at Sheffield for a year.
Yeah.
And Lauren Maya was at Cheshire for a year. And Lauren Maya was an NBA player, basically a year out of the NBA. So he wasn't a washed-up NBA player. He was a proper NBA player. But they were only there for a year. So, if I'm talking about the greatest players in BBL history, I think probably Nigel. Nigel for the years that he did. Scants, leads the league in scoring in history, 8,500 points. You can't, if you look at career stats. I have to put Fab in there because he leads the league in assists, blocks, steals, and fouls. And played for 22 years and won so much and made so many winning plays, even though he didn't make winning plays in the way that people normally see them. And obviously, slightly before my time is Alton Bird and Alan Cunningham. That's slightly before my time because basketball in the North, we weren't very good, so we didn't see very much of them up in the Northeast. So I didn't really, and they weren't really on telly, so I didn't really see that much. There was a guy in the North, Russ Saunders, who was incredible. I watched growing up at Sunderland. He was incredible. Scored 30 a game just without trying. But that's probably about it. I think, and the ones I've coached, since I've coached in the last 10 years, probably Charles or Drew. Charles Smith or Drew Sullivan. I would never. You see, I coached so many games. I was involved with so many games where either Charles won the game or Drew won the game by making the right play at the right time, often against each other. So Charles won the last one, so Drew's going to win the next one, something like that. That I just can't separate them. Because every time I think, well, Drew won that, Drew made those plays. I think, oh, well, Charles made those plays. So I can't separate them. And I'm a great fan of winning players, not just players who come and score 25 a night. You have to. It's how you perform in the biggest moments that matters.
And then finally, give us your predictions on paper for the coming BBL season. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, well, obviously the Eagles will win because I'm still Mac's friend. That's true. Well, London have an incredible roster, which I think is basically. I've been back in my head and I can't even contemplate it being like any roster I've ever seen in the league, even going back 30 years. I don't remember any team having 15 players or 14 players of that level, ever. Ever. Even in the teams that won everything, back in the old days, Kingston, Guildford, they had like 9 players. They just had the best 8-9 players. Maybe Brighton Bears, maybe Brighton when Nick was trying to take over Europe. They had a lot of talent one of those years, I think, when he had a European competition at ULEB Cup level. And he was signing players left, right and centre. So, you'd have to look at it and think, well, either someone has to beat London or they're going to beat themselves with the amount of players that they've got. And you can never know when you've got that many new personalities in the team, you never know how it's going to mesh. And only 5 can play at any one time. But if you're looking at it on a logical level, over the basis of a kind of a lengthy season, on a talent level, you'd say that they were the prohibitive favourites. Rob's got a good squad, as ever. He's got his young British kids aren't young anymore and they know how to win. That's a big thing. He found a good, as you would call it, plastic Brit shooter last year in Corey Johnson, who really helped them at the end of last year. He's got another plastic Brit centre in Mo Walker, who was coming off a year off and very talented. And we got 4 Americans as well. So, and he'll have good Americans. So, and they'll be ready to play and they'll be competitive. And it's a change because, I talked about this with Rob many a time as we were playing Leicester through the decade. How the change in a team's, in almost an organisation's mentality from when you're the chaser to when you're the chased. So, Leicester were always chasing us until probably about 2015, 2016. They were always putting teams together to beat us, which was absolutely the right thing to do because we were on the top. And then they got there and they beat us. And then they had a year or two of where they were better than us. And Rob, I think, then understood then the difference because teams are suddenly coming after you. The target is on your back. And it was like, man, you guys had this for so many years. People just don't know what it's like, And he's right. They don't. It's the easiest thing in the world is to put together a team to win for a year. The hardest thing in the world is to do it year after year after year when everybody's coming after you. And now that's London now. So Leicester are now the chaser, and they're now chasing London because everybody's hearing about London's team, and that will be an interesting dynamic. I think we're under the radar a little bit But we have, I think we've recruited pretty well. I've seen the guys practice, and I think we're pretty solid. I think Cortez Edwards is a very, very solid player, and the 2 American guys that we've signed, 2 big guys we've signed, are really going to be good in the league. So I wouldn't wouldn't push us down there. And after that, everybody's kind of sort of worked out recruitment. Over the past 2 or 3 years, recruitment in the league has got 100 times better than it was 8 or 9 years ago. 100 times better. Everybody is now pretty solid, and that's even look at the guy at Manchester, didn't win a game last year. Danny's recruited really well this year. He's got a proper squad there. So when there's a league with only 11 teams in, and nobody's the whipping boy, if I can put it that way, that makes for a pretty exciting league. And obviously you got the guys down at Plymouth, PJ, and the money that's coming at Plymouth there as well. No one likes going down to Plymouth. Nobody. It's miles and miles and miles away from Bristol. It's further away from Birmingham. It's a hell of a lot further away from Newcastle. So 9 hours on a bus on a Saturday, then getting out of bed and playing on the hard floor at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon is not popular with anybody. And they're going to be an absolute beast. And then Treon and Rashad Hassan and Lavelle Cook and Theo and those guys in that gym, we've never won an easy game in that gym ever. Even when you've walked in thinking we've got enough talent to win by 20, we don't. So I just think it'd be a really exciting league to watch on from afar, or not that far, but watch on from reasonably close to, keeping a close eye on, and to kind of reposition myself as kind of a loudmouth, know-it-all pundit again. It'd be kind of fun.
Perfect. That's a perfect place to leave it. Hopefully the coronavirus doesn't put a stop to the season and we get to see it played through. But yeah, Dave, thank you so much. Thanks for your service over the last 10 years on the sidelines and all the insight into British basketball. This little conversation we've had, I greatly appreciate. It's been very helpful for sort of my bigger picture of the whole game as well. And all the best with the next steps.
Top man, thank you.